All right, welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're heading to a place that's often called the Pearl of Africa, and for good reason.
Yeah, Uganda.
Uganda? Think about it, lush rainforests, just absolutely bursting with life, stretching out into these wide open savannas, and everywhere you look, incredible creatures. I mean, we're talking majestic mountain gorillas, elephants, some of the most amazing, but also, sadly, some of the most vulnerable wildlife on the planet.
It's really a special place.
It is. So to really get a grip on this incredible destination, we've got a whole bunch of really insightful information to help us understand what's going on with sustainable tourism in Uganda. We've got reports and guides that specifically focus on, responsible tourism practices in Uganda, boots on the ground kind of stuff. But we also have this in-depth report on Uganda's tourism economy, fresh off the press, March 2024. So what we're going to try and do today is unpack all of this. How is Uganda navigating this global shift towards more sustainable forms of tourism? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And what does it all mean for preserving its natural beauty, its cultural heritage, while, at the same time, making sure local communities are benefiting? So let's get started.
Yeah.
Let's dive in.
Let's start maybe by setting the scene a little bit, by looking at the kind of global context of sustainable tourism. What's happening out there. And one of the things that's very clear from the latest travel reports is that a huge number of travelers globally are saying they want to travel more sustainably. They're aware of the impact of travel, and they want to make sure that their choices are actually having a positive effect.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners would agree with that. But the thing is, and the reports point this out, even though people want to travel sustainably, a lot of them struggle to actually find those sustainable options when they're booking their trips, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's this gap. People want it, but it can be hard to actually find and book those trips. And this is where, destinations like Uganda that can really showcase their commitment to sustainability, it would present themselves as genuinely sustainable. That's a huge opportunity.
Yeah.
And, another big trend that we're seeing globally is this growing interest in nature-based experiences. People want to get out into nature. They want to go to more rural destinations. They want to get off the beaten track.
Yeah.
And they want to connect with local people in a way that's, feels authentic, feels real, and is actually beneficial for everyone involved.
Yeah. It's not just about ticking off landmarks anymore. It's about the whole experience.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that idea of responsibility, it's not just about the environment anymore either, is it? When we talk about sustainability in tourism, it's broadened out. So, of course, the environment is still absolutely crucial, that kind of green element. Yeah. But there's a real emphasis now on the social responsibility of tourism, too. The good, if you like.
Right.
People want to know that their money is actually benefiting local communities.
Yeah.
That it's helping to preserve cultural heritage.
Yeah, which makes perfect sense. I mean, if you're going to experience a unique culture or a pristine natural environment, you want to make sure that your visit's actually helping to protect those things.
Exactly. Yeah. Absolutely.
Not doing harm. Now, what about the industry itself? Are they keeping up with this change in how travelers feel?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. A lot of international tour operators, they're either already certified in some form of sustainability, or they're working towards it. They're trying to meet that demand.
Yeah.
But the problem they often run into is finding suppliers who are also operating sustainably. The lodges, the local guides, transport providers.
Right.
So that creates a bit of a bottleneck. They want to offer these sustainable trips, but it's hard to find all the different pieces of the puzzle, so to speak.
So there's demand from travelers, there's tour operators who are trying to do the right thing, but then when you get to destinations like Uganda, maybe there needs to be more of those sustainable options on the ground.
Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about Uganda specifically then. I mean, we mentioned it at the beginning. It has these incredible natural assets. It has cultural riches.
Absolutely.
The volcanic landscapes, the diverse wildlife. It's a dream destination for a lot of people.
It is. Yeah, it really is. But as we kind of delve into this, it's really important to remember the local context, know? A very large percentage of Uganda's population lives in rural areas, and they face significant poverty.
Yeah.
Often they have limited access to things that many of us take for granted, like electricity, clean water.
Right, yeah. So you can see how tourism has the potential to be really transformative here.
Absolutely.
It can reach these rural populations. It can support these vital conservation efforts. And, I'm thinking about, when we were talking about the gorillas earlier, how vulnerable they are.
Yeah. Tourism has a huge role to play in protecting them.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, tourism is really critical in protecting gorillas from all sorts of threats, everything from diseases that can be transmitted by humans to, really big issues like potential oil drilling in protected areas.
Right.
So the story of mountain gorilla conservation in Uganda, specifically in Bwindi Impenetrable and Gahinga Gorilla National Parks, it's actually a really remarkable success story, and tourism is a central part of that.
Yeah. It is an incredible achievement. I mean, even though the permits are pretty expensive, about $600.
Yeah.
That strictly regulated tourism, the limited number of visitors, that's been a huge factor in the gorilla population actually increasing.
Absolutely.
Which is amazing. And they're even talking about maybe raising the price of the permits even more to something like Rwanda's level, which is, $1,500.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, isn't it? This kind of exclusive tourism model. We see it in other fragile, iconic sites like the Galapagos, like Machu Picchu.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think what's interesting there is that balance, While it can seem, a little bit exclusionary in some ways, in the case of the gorillas, those low visitor numbers, the very strict regulations, like you can only visit for 1 hour. That's not just about the quality of the tourist experience. It's absolutely essential for the gorilla's long-term well-being. It minimizes stress. It helps prevent the transmission of diseases. Even something as seemingly minor as the common cold could be devastating for them. So, it's a really specific example of how international best practices in conservation are being applied in a very crucial context.
Right. So it's a tough balance, isn't it? Making those experiences accessible while at the same time making sure that we're protecting these endangered creatures for the future. And the money that's generated from these permits, as far as we understand it, it's reinvested directly back into the national parks and the gorilla protection efforts.
Right. Yeah.
So there is that direct link. But one of the things that the reports also highlight is that there's a human cost to this conservation success story that isn't always obvious to tourists. And that's the story of the Batwa people.
Yeah.
These forests that are now national parks, these protected areas, they were once home to this ancient hunter-gatherer tribe, the Batwa, who lived in harmony with the forest, for centuries.
Yeah. And when those national parks were created back in 1991, they were evicted from their ancestral lands.
Yeah.
And became conservation refugees, essentially.
Right. Yeah, it's a really stark reminder of how conservation efforts, even though they're well-intentioned, they can have these really profound, often negative impacts on local communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And the consequences for the Batwa have been really severe. They faced marginalization. When they were moved outside of the forests, they lost their traditional way of life, which was so intricately connected to the forest. And tragically, their life expectancy is significantly lower now.
Yeah.
They didn't have farming traditions. They often had difficulty communicating with neighboring communities who had very different ways of life. And sadly, they were, often looked down upon.
Huh.
So, when we talk about Uganda's tourism assets, we also have to remember these human stories that are intertwined with conservation.
Yeah, it is this really stark contrast, isn't it? The gorilla population is thriving, in part thanks to tourism.
Yeah.
But the people who live sustainably alongside them for centuries are really struggling now. It raises some really important questions about, the ethics of conservation and who benefits and who bears the cost.
It does. It really does. And it's a question that's relevant in conservation efforts around the world.
Yeah.
There are initiatives that are trying to address this. The Batwa experience near Mukahinga Gorilla National Park is a really good example of how that global push for more socially responsible tourism is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah.
So the Batwa experience involves the local Batwa community in tourism.
Yeah.
It allows them to share their traditions, their knowledge within the park. And importantly, they can actually go back into the forest with the permission of the Uganda Wildlife Authority.
Wow.
They act as guides for these tours. So this not only gives them a source of income, which is desperately needed, but it also allows them to reconnect with their heritage in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, so it's a step in the right direction, isn't it? It's a way for them to benefit economically from tourism, from their ancestral lands, but also to really share their culture with visitors. It's a much more inclusive, a more equitable kind of tourism.
Yeah, it's a really positive development, I think. But it's important to remember that not all Botwa encounters are ethical.
Right.
Sadly, there are reports of exploitative situations where they're treated more as a spectacle. They're not really benefiting. There's no real consent. So, travelers need to do their research. They need to make sure that any tours that they choose are responsible and are genuinely supporting the Botwa people and their self-determination.
Absolutely. It's a good reminder that responsible tourism isn't just about protecting the environment. It's about protecting people. It's about making sure that local communities aren't just protected from negative impacts, but that they're actually empowered to participate in and benefit from tourism. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and look at the broader picture of Uganda's tourism economy. That 2024 report that we mentioned earlier, it highlights how important tourism was to Uganda's economy before the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2019, according to the report, tourism contributed a really significant 5.9% to Uganda's overall GDP.
Wow.
And the World Bank estimated that it supported around 670,000 jobs across the country. So a huge part of the national labor force.
Yeah.
And in that same year, 2019, international arrivals reached 1.5 million. So it was a really significant sector.
Yeah, but then the report makes this really interesting point that only a small fraction of those arrivals, something like 126,000, were actually leisure travelers.
Yeah.
So the majority of the tourists were actually from neighboring countries, and they were there for business or other purposes. So that suggests that there's this big potential market for international leisure tourism to Uganda.
Huge potential. Yeah, absolutely. And the leisure travelers that did come to Uganda, they tended to stay for a good amount of time, an average of 7 to 12 nights. And quite a few of them were booking these package tours.
Right.
So it's interesting, even though Uganda has, it struggles with international brand recognition compared to some of its neighbors, like Kenya and Tanzania, it actually gets really high satisfaction ratings from the travelers that do make the journey.
Wow.
So that says a lot about the quality of the experience on the ground.
Yeah, it really does. It's like this hidden gem almost,
Yeah.
And the report also delves into, where Ugandans are particularly strong in the global tourism market.
Yeah.
What are some of those niche areas?
Yeah. So while general online searches for travel to Uganda might not be as high as some other destinations in the region, it actually does really well in those searches that are more specific, that are focused on particular types of tourism. So it performs well in searches for ecotourism, for nature tourism, for trips that are focused on the active lifestyle, hiking, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And also arts and cultural tourism. So this shows that Uganda has these inherent strengths. And that's where its marketing efforts should really be, they should be focusing on attracting those travelers who are specifically looking for those kinds of experiences.
Makes sense. And then, of course, we can't talk about tourism without talking about the pandemic. I mean, it had a huge impact on the sector globally, and Uganda was no exception. But the report also suggests that there's been this really interesting shift in what travelers are looking for as the sector recovers.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has accelerated a trend that was already happening, So there's a much bigger focus now on destinations that are off the beaten path, a much stronger desire for sustainable tourism, and a real yearning for those meaningful interactions with local communities, and a real focus on well-being and connection with nature.
Yeah.
So, these shifts in traveler preferences, they actually align really well with Uganda's existing strength.
Yeah.
So it's natural beauty, it's rich cultural heritage. These are things that travelers are increasingly looking for. So you can see how the pandemic, while it's been disruptive, it's also created new opportunities.
So Uganda has all of these amazing assets. It seems to be well placed to cater to these evolving traveler preferences. But the 2024 report also identifies some key challenges and gaps that need to be addressed in the country's sustainable tourism efforts.
Yeah.
So what are some of the most pressing issues that Uganda needs to tackle?
Well, one big gap is that there isn't a a locally relevant and cost-effective certification system for sustainable tourism practices.
Right.
So a lot of tourism operators in Uganda are already doing things sustainably, or they want to, but they don't really have a way to show that, you know.
Yeah.
They lack a credible and affordable way to prove to buyers and ultimately to travelers, you know,
Right.
that they are operating sustainably. So it's hard for them to stand out.
Makes sense. If
Yeah,
there's no recognized stamp of approval, it's harder to prove it to tourists, and it's harder for tourists to make those choices that align with their values. What's another key challenge?
Another really important issue is that, you know, often the local communities don't always have a strong incentive to protect the very things that tourism depends on, you know, the natural assets. So if they don't have a real stake in the tourism economy, they might not be motivated to protect the wildlife, the natural habitats,
Right.
you know, and sometimes there can even be, you know, conflicts of interest. So making sure that local people actually see tangible benefits from tourism, that's really crucial for long-term sustainability.
Yeah, it comes back to that idea of shared benefit, doesn't it? If tourism is going to be truly sustainable, it needs to be a win-win situation for everyone, visitors, tourism operators, and most importantly, the communities who are, you know, the custodians of these incredible places. The report also talks about research and marketing.
Yes.
You know, what are some of the findings there?
So while Uganda is clearly doing well in those niche markets that we talked about, there's still a need for more targeted research to really understand these travelers.
Right.
You know, to know what they're looking for and then to tailor the marketing to really reach them effectively.
Yeah.
And there's also, you know, a lot of potential to diversify what Uganda offers to tourists.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just about the national parks. It's about developing things like community-led conservancies, promoting cultural experiences. So not putting all the eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Yeah.
And really empowering those local communities to showcase what they have to offer, which in turn can create a much more authentic experience for visitors.
And the report also talks about some of the practical challenges that tourism operators face in Uganda.
Yeah, things like access to capital, to funding.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big hurdle for a lot of operators, particularly small, locally owned businesses. You know, often banks see the tourism sector as being risky.
Right.
So that can mean high interest rates, loan terms that aren't really suitable for tourism businesses, especially if they're trying to, you know, invest in sustainable practices.
Yeah.
And then another thing that the report highlights is that there needs to be better coordination among all the different organizations that are trying to support tourism in Uganda.
Right.
You know, government agencies, NGOs, private sector associations, they all have a role to play, but sometimes they're not working together as effectively as they could. So, you know, better collaboration could really streamline things and make sure that all those efforts are having the biggest impact.
So there are a lot of moving pieces, but improving that coordination and making sure that people have access to the finance they need, that could really make a difference.
Yeah.
Now, based on all these challenges that have been identified, what kind of recommendations does the 2024 report make for creating a more sustainable tourism sector in Uganda?
Well, the first thing it says is that there needs to be support for a sustainable tourism certification program.
Okay.
And it needs to be, you know, cost competitive, locally relevant, tailored to Uganda's specific context.
Makes sense.
And the second key recommendation is to really strengthen efforts to establish these community conservancies, to make sure the communities have real ownership and to encourage partnerships between the conservancies and private sector operators. So those two things kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
Yeah, they do. So empowering communities and then making sure that there's this recognized framework to promote and validate their sustainable practices.
Yeah.
What else does the report suggest?
It also says that there needs to be more training.
Okay.
You know, practical skills training to help local communities develop their own tourism products and services. You know, things like crafting or guiding or running small accommodations, offering cultural experiences, that kind of thing.
Right.
And the report also says that it's really important to support the marketing and sales of Ugandan sustainable tourism products.
Okay.
To get those experiences out there and make them easy for the right kind of travelers to find and book. And that means doing more research, you know, collecting data, understanding what travelers want. And the final recommendation is about finance. The report says that there needs to be more work done with banks to help them understand the tourism sector better and to make it easier for tourism businesses to access the capital they need.
Yeah.
Potentially through special loan products or more favorable terms that are designed for the needs of the industry.
So it sounds like a pretty solid roadmap.
Yeah.
Lots of different actions that can be taken to move towards a more sustainable, more equitable tourism sector in Uganda. And it's encouraging that there's already some support and initiatives in place, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. The EU is currently developing a new program that's specifically designed to support sustainable tourism in Uganda.
Wow.
And there's also the UDB EU Tourism COVID-19 Response Facility.
Right.
Which has been providing loans and grants to help the tourism sector recover from the pandemic.
Yeah.
And it's also been encouraging businesses to adopt these greening initiatives and to get certified. As of March 2024, a significant number of establishments across Uganda were already benefiting from that facility.
That's great. And there are other organizations as well, aren't there, that are doing work in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So groups like GGZ, CBI, Enable, the World Bank, WWF, USAI, they're all involved in a variety of different projects.
Wow.
Things like skills development for communities, supporting the establishment of community conservancies, investing in infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then there are also private sector associations like ESTOA, the Exclusive Sustainable Tour Operators Association, which is really championing sustainable practices within the industry.
So it really seems like there's this collaborative effort underway, which is fantastic. As we wrap things up, then thinking about everything we've discussed, how does Uganda's situation really align with those broader global trends in sustainable tourism that we talked about at the beginning?
I think what's really interesting here is how Uganda's unique challenges, things like the high levels of rural poverty, the history of displacement for conservation, those things mean that it needs to find its own way of doing sustainable tourism. Mm-hmm. So while it's important to learn from global best practices and meet those growing expectations of travelers like our listeners, for responsible and authentic experiences, Uganda really has an opportunity here to stand out by focusing on community involvement, by really prioritizing the preservation of both its natural and its cultural heritage. And by doing that, it can offer something truly unique and special.
Yeah, it's about finding that sweet spot, isn't it? Where conservation, community rights, and the desires of travelers all come together.
Absolutely. And by prioritizing community ownership, by developing those locally relevant certification systems, and by really strategically marketing its niche, in sustainable nature and cultural tourism, Uganda has the potential not just to thrive as a destination, but to really be a leader in responsible travel.
So to sum it all up for our listeners, Uganda has this incredible potential to be a leading sustainable tourism destination. It has the natural beauty, it has this vibrant culture, but realizing that potential really means addressing some key challenges.
Yeah.
Like we've talked about, the need for a local certification system, empowering local communities, really targeting the marketing, making sure that there's access to finance for businesses.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember that responsible tourism in Uganda isn't just about protecting the environment, it's about protecting people too. Mm. We've seen that in the story of the Batwa.
Yeah.
And it's about addressing those broader issues of rural poverty.
And so this leaves us with one final thought for you to consider. As travelers around the world are increasingly seeking out experiences that are not only memorable, but sustainable and truly meaningful, how can Uganda best balance those conservation goals with the rights and the livelihoods of its people?
Yeah.
How can it really showcase itself as the Pearl of Africa in this new world of responsible tourism?
Yeah.
We encourage you to think about your own role in making sustainable travel choices and maybe explore some of those initiatives that we've talked about today. So thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.